On the scorching night of July 4th, 1857, in New Orleans, Louisiana, an illegal underground fighting arena known as the Pit became the stage for one of the most violent slave uprisings in Southern history. 33 white men, plantation owners, overseers, slave traders, and wealthy spectators, were slaughtered in less than 2 hours by enslaved fighters they had forced to battle to the death for entertainment. Leading this massacre was a 28-year-old woman named Asha, a Dahomey warrior captured from West Africa, who transformed from forced gladiator into avenging angel, using nothing but arena weapons, tactical brilliance inherited from her warrior lineage, and the rage of 200 years of bondage. She orchestrated a rebellion that would send shockwaves through Louisiana's entire slaveholding class and inspire resistance movements across the Deep South. But this story begins 9 years earlier, in 1848, on the western coast of Africa, in the Kingdom of Dahomey, where a 19-year-old warrior named Asha served in the elite all-female regiment known as the Mino, or as Europeans called them, the Dahomey Amazons. These women were the most feared warriors in West Africa, trained from childhood in combat, strategy, and absolute fearlessness. Asha had earned her place among them through exceptional skill with the machete and an ability to read battlefield movements like others read books. She stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, unusually tall for the period, with muscles carved by years of rigorous training. Her skin bore the ritual scarification marks of her people, telling the story of her lineage and achievements. She had killed 7 enemy warriors in battle by the time she turned 18. She knew no fear of death, only the warrior's code, honor through combat, protection of her people, death before dishonor. The day the slavers came, Asha was not in formation with her regiment. She had been sent with a small group to a coastal village to investigate reports of Portuguese ships. It was a trap. A rival kingdom had made arrangements with the slavers, betraying the Dahomey patrol for guns and rum. 20 warriors went to that village. Only 3 survived the ambush to be chained. Asha watched her sisters die fighting, taking 5 slavers with them before being overwhelmed. She herself killed 2 men, even after being shot in the shoulder, fighting with a broken spear until sheer numbers brought her down. They beat her unconscious, branded her chest with a hot iron, and threw her into the hold of a ship called the Esperanza. Bitter irony, as Esperanza meant hope in Spanish, and hope was the first thing that died in that darkness. The Middle Passage lasted 47 days. Asha spent every moment of those 47 days planning. While others prayed or wept or went mad in the suffocating darkness, she studied. She studied the patterns of the sailors' footsteps above. She studied the timing of the food distributions. She studied the weaknesses in the chains. She studied the other captives, identifying those who still had fight in them. On the 32nd day, she organized a revolt. They managed to kill 6 sailors and briefly took control of the lower deck. But the crew had firearms and experience putting down such rebellions. They crushed the uprising with brutal efficiency, killing 23 rebels as examples. Asha survived only because the captain recognized her value. A tall, muscular woman who could fight was worth more alive than dead. They whipped her 90 times, breaking her back into submission. They put her in thumbscrews for 3 days. They starved her for a week, but they could not break her mind. When the Esperanza finally reached New Orleans in October of 1848, Asha was purchased at the St. Louis Hotel slave auction by a man named Cornelius Blackwood. Blackwood was not a plantation owner. He was something worse, an entertainment entrepreneur who ran an illegal underground fighting operation for the city's wealthy elite. He had paid $1,200 for Asha, an enormous sum, because he saw what others missed: a trained warrior, female novelty, exotic appeal, and most importantly, a killer's eyes. She would be his greatest investment, his deadliest attraction, his Gladiator of Louisiana. The pit was located beneath a warehouse in the Vieux Carré, the French Quarter, accessible only through a hidden entrance in a cooperage on Chartres Street. The warehouse above was legitimate, storing cotton and sugar waiting for shipment. But below, carved into the earth and reinforced with brick, was an arena of death. The fighting pit itself measured 30 feet in diameter, surrounded by tiered seating for up to 200 spectators. Torches lined the walls, casting flickering shadows that danced across the blood-stained sand. The ceiling was low, barely 10 feet high, creating a sense of claustrophobia and intimacy with the violence. The air always smelled of blood, sweat, torch smoke, and the perfume of wealthy men who came to watch human beings destroy each other. Blackwood was 42 years old, a second-generation New Orleans resident whose father had made a fortune in the cotton trade. Cornelius had inherited money, but lacked his father's business acumen. He was a gambler, a drinker, and a man addicted to spectacle. He stood 6 feet tall, portly from good living, with thinning brown hair slicked back with pomade and a thick moustache that he constantly groomed. He wore expensive suits, always perfectly tailored, always with a gold watch chain, always with diamond cufflinks. He smoked cigars that cost more than most men earned in a week. He spoke with the refined accent of New Orleans aristocracy, educated at institutions in Europe, well-read, cultured, and utterly devoid of empathy for those he considered property. The pit had been operating for 5 years when Asher arrived. Blackwood's fighters were all enslaved men and women, purchased specifically for their physical attributes or, in rare cases, captured after attempting escape and sold cheap to recover losses. He kept approximately 20 fighters at any given time, housed in cells beneath the arena, fed well enough to maintain strength, trained constantly, and forced to fight every Saturday night when the wealthy gathered. Death matches were not every week. Most fights were to submission or first blood. But approximately once per month, Blackwood would stage a fight to the death, and the wagering would reach thousands of dollars. He had connections throughout the city, judges, politicians, police captains, all of whom either participated in the gambling or received payments to look the other way. Asher's first fight came 3 weeks after her purchase, time Blackwood used to let her heal from the middle passage and to begin her training. But Asher needed no training in combat. What she needed was to understand the rules of this new battlefield. The overseer of the fighters was a man named Dutch Keller, a former bare-knuckle boxer from New York who had fled south after killing a man in an illegal match. Dutch was 35, heavily scarred, missing his left ear and brutal in his training methods. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, but weighed over 230 pounds, all of it muscle and meanness. He wore his brown hair short, his face was perpetually unshaven, and his small blue eyes held a predator's assessment of everything he saw. Dutch recognized immediately that Asher was different from other fighters. Most enslaved fighters were field hands or house slaves who had committed some infraction, people with strength but no combat training. Asher moved like a soldier. Her posture, her awareness, her reaction time, everything indicated formal military training. Dutch approached Blackwood with a proposal: market her as an African Amazon, play up the exotic warrior angle, match her first against men to prove she could fight, then create specialty matches that would draw huge crowds. Blackwood loved the idea. The marketing practically wrote itself. For Asher's debut match, Blackwood selected an opponent named Caesar, a field hand from a sugar plantation who had broken an overseer's jaw and been sold to the pit as punishment. Caesar was 6 feet 3 inches tall, 240 pounds, and had won 7 of his 9 fights. The crowd that Saturday night was particularly large. Word had spread about the African woman warrior, and curiosity brought out over 180 spectators. They filled the tiered seats, smoking cigars, drinking imported whiskey, dressed in their finest evening wear, as if attending the opera rather than a blood sport. Their wives and daughters knew nothing of these Saturday night excursions. This was a gentleman's secret, a place where they could unleash their most primal desires without judgment from polite society. The fight began with traditional arena rules. No weapons, fight to submission or knockout. Winner received better food for a week and a night without chains. The bell rang at 9 o'clock in the evening. Caesar charged immediately, using his size advantage, attempting to overpower Asha with brute strength. She sidestepped his rush with fluid grace, striking his kidney as he passed. The crowd murmured, impressed. Caesar turned, more cautious now, circling. He threw a heavy right hand. She blocked, deflected, and struck his throat with her fingertips. Not hard enough to crush, but enough to make breathing painful. He backed off, coughing. The white men in the audience were leaning forward now, cigars forgotten, drinks ignored. This woman fought like nothing they had seen before. For 11 minutes, Asha dismantled Caesar with surgical precision. She targeted pressure points, joints, and soft tissue. She used his momentum against him. She demonstrated techniques the crowd did not recognize because they came from African martial traditions unknown in the West. When Caesar finally collapsed, unable to rise, his left knee destroyed by a precise kick, the crowd erupted in applause and roared approval. Blackwood smiled, calculating the fortune he would make. Dutch nodded with professional appreciation. And Asha stood in the center of the pit, her face expressionless, her body barely winded, and her mind already planning how this arena would become a killing ground. Over the next 9 years, from 1848 to 1857, Asha fought 63 matches in the pit. She won 63 matches. She killed when required to kill, which happened 11 times when Blackwood staged death matches for special occasions. She killed cleanly, efficiently, giving her opponents quick deaths when possible, mercy in a place that knew no mercy. The other fighters came to respect her, then to revere her, then to see her as something more than human. A warrior saint, justice incarnate, hope in chains. She learned English, though she spoke little, preferring to listen and observe. She learned the layout of the pit completely, every entrance, every hallway, every storage room, every weakness. She learned the patterns of the guards, the schedule of the fights, the behavior of the crowd. She learned which spectators were merely cruel and which were monsters. The segment break. Among those monsters was Judge Nathaniel Rutherford, a Louisiana Supreme Court justice who attended the pit almost every Saturday night. Rutherford was 53 years old. A tall, thin man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and cruelty. He had sentenced more runaway slaves to death than any other judge in Louisiana history. He had written legal opinions defending the expansion of slavery. He had personally owned 4 plantations and over 300 slaves. But his true passion was watching people die in the pit. He always sat in the front row, always requested death matches, and always wagered enormous sums. He had once paid Blackwood $5,000 to stage a fight where a mother was forced to battle her own son. The son had refused to fight and was shot. Rutherford had laughed. Another regular was Henry Beaumont, a slave trader who operated the largest auction house in New Orleans. Beaumont was 47, short and rotund, with a florid face and watery blue eyes. He dressed in expensive but garish clothing, favoring bright colors and excessive jewelry. He bought and sold human beings like livestock, separating families without thought, selling children away from mothers for profit. And he did it all with a jovial smile and folksy charm that made him popular in business circles. He attended the pit to identify potential fighters, purchasing slaves who showed spirit or strength, breaking them in his private facility, then selling them to Blackwood at markup. He had personally been responsible for destroying at least 200 families that Asha knew of. Then there was Montgomery Whitfield, a plantation owner from St. Charles Parish who was infamous even among slaveholders for his cruelty. Whitfield was 39, handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, with dark hair, piercing green eyes, and the bearing of old Southern money. His family had owned land in Louisiana since the French colonial period. His plantation, Whitfield Manor, was one of the largest in the state. Over 4,000 acres of sugar cane worked by 530 slaves. Stories about Whitfield circulated among the enslaved population throughout Louisiana. Stories of torture, of slaves buried alive for minor infractions, of women forced into his bed and killed when they became pregnant, of children sold away as punishment to parents who displeased him. He attended the pit monthly and always requested the most violent matches available. The overseer Dutch Keller was another kind of monster. While Blackwood provided the business and the spectators provided the money, Dutch was the day-to-day architect of suffering in the pit. He woke the fighters at 5 in the morning every day. He ran them through brutal training, 4 hours of combat practice, 2 hours of strength conditioning, endless repetition, until their bodies moved on instinct. He fed them well, better than most plantation slaves, because Blackwood needed them strong. But Dutch also maintained discipline through fear and pain. Fighters who showed weakness were whipped. Fighters who refused to train were starved. Fighters who tried to escape, and 3 had tried in the years before Usher arrived, were tortured publicly in the pit as examples, then sold to the worst plantations Dutch could find, sugar plantations in the Delta, where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. But Dutch made a critical mistake with Asha. He recognized her skill and gave her privileges, a slightly larger cell, an extra blanket in winter, occasionally fresh fruit. He thought these small kindnesses would ensure her loyalty. What he did not understand was that Asha was not a house slave, grateful for scraps of humanity. She was a warrior who remembered freedom, who had commanded troops in battle, who understood that kindness from captors was still captivity. She accepted his privileges with carefully calculated gratitude, playing the role of the tamed warrior, all while she watched and waited and planned. The other fighters in the pit during Asha's time included 17 men and 2 other women. The men ranged from field hands to skilled craftsmen who had committed infractions. There was Moses, a blacksmith from Virginia, who had struck an overseer, 41 years old, massive and strong, but slow. There was Solomon, a house slave from a Charleston mansion who had been caught teaching other slaves to read, 33 years old, educated and clever. There was Samson, a field hand from Mississippi who stood 6 feet 5 inches tall and had once lifted a cotton bale by himself, 26 years old, powerful but gentle by nature. There was Jupiter, a runaway from Alabama who had been captured by slave catchers, 29 years old, fast and cunning. And there was young Isaac, just 20 years old, born into slavery on a Louisiana plantation, sold to the pit after fighting with an overseer who had raped his sister. The 2 other women fighters were Rose and Dinah. Rose was 35. A former house slave from a Savannah mansion who had poisoned her mistress after years of abuse. She was small, just 5 feet 2 inches, but vicious in the pit, using speed and dirty tactics to win. Dinah was 24, born on a tobacco plantation in Kentucky, sold south after refusing the master's advances. She was quiet, deeply religious, and fought with tears streaming down her face, hating every moment, but having no choice. These 19 people lived in cells beneath the arena, locked away except for training and fights. Their cells were 6 feet by 8 feet, containing only a thin mattress, a blanket, and a bucket. They could hear each other through the walls, but could not see each other except during training. They developed a communication system, tapping codes on pipes, passing whispered messages during the brief moments when guards were distracted, creating a community in chains. And Asha became the center of that community, not through words, but through presence. The other fighters saw in her something they had almost lost, Dignity that could not be broken, spirit that refused to bend, proof that not all captives became broken. For 9 years, Asha waited. She fought when forced to fight. She killed when forced to kill. She observed everything and everyone. She catalogued weaknesses. She identified escape routes. She noted patterns in the guard rotations. She learned that Saturday night fights ended around 11 o'clock. She learned that after fights, the guards were often drunk, paid off with whiskey by Blackwood to celebrate successful events. She learned that weapons were stored in a room adjacent to the pit, accessible through a door that was locked but not heavily guarded. She learned that Blackwood kept the keys to all the fighter cells on a ring attached to his belt. She learned that the spectators were their most vulnerable when drunk and satisfied after a night of violence, their guard down, their weapons holstered, their minds clouded. But Asha needed a catalyst, a moment when rebellion would be worth the certain death that would follow, because she understood clearly that any uprising in the pit would end in death for the fighters. There was no path to freedom from New Orleans in 1857. The city was surrounded by slave patrols. The Mississippi River was watched constantly. The swamps were patrolled by men with bloodhounds, and the road north was impossible for escaped slaves without papers. But Asha had been trained as a warrior, and warriors understood that some battles were worth fighting, even when victory meant death. The goal was not escape. The goal was justice. If you are feeling rage right now, you should. These horrors happened on American soil, in American cities, sanctioned by American law. The pit was not unique. Throughout the South, similar arenas existed. Places where the wealthy could indulge their darkest desires while society looked away. History books rarely mention them, because acknowledging their existence would complicate the comfortable narratives we tell about our past. The catalyst came on June 6th, 1857, exactly 4 weeks before the 4th of July. A new fighter was brought to the pit, a 15-year-old boy named Samuel. Samuel had been born on a plantation in Mississippi, the son of a woman named Mary, who had been used by the master for breeding. Mary had given birth to 11 children over 18 years, all of them sold away from her before they turned 10. Samuel had been kept longer only because he showed promise as a field hand, strong for his age and quick to learn. But Samuel's master had gambling debts. He had bet heavily on cotton futures and lost. He needed cash quickly, so he sold his most valuable assets, his strongest young slaves. Samuel had been purchased by a slave trader for $800 and brought to New Orleans, where Henry Beaumont saw potential and sold him to Blackwood for $1,200. Samuel arrived at the pit terrified and confused. He had never seen a city before. He had never been away from his mother. He had never been in a fight beyond scuffles with other children. Blackwood looked at this frightened boy and saw profit. The crowds loved novelty. A teenager thrown into the pit against grown men would draw enormous interest and enormous wages. Dutch Keller was ordered to prepare Samuel for a debut fight in 3 weeks. Dutch looked at the boy, saw raw material, and began brutal training immediately. For 3 weeks, Samuel was beaten into shape. Dutch forced him to train from dawn until dusk. When Samuel was too slow, Dutch whipped him. When Samuel showed fear, Dutch starved him. When Samuel cried for his mother, Dutch mocked him until the tears stopped and rage replaced them. By the end of 3 weeks, Samuel had gained 10 pounds of muscle, had learned basic fighting techniques, and had developed the dead eyes of someone who has accepted that life is only suffering. He was matched against Moses, the blacksmith, in what was billed as a test of youth versus experience. The wagers were heavy. The crowd anticipated an entertaining mismatch. The fight was scheduled for June 27th, 3 weeks after Samuel's arrival. Asha watched the boy during training and saw herself 9 years earlier, captured, chained, forced into violence, stripped of everything except the core of identity that no one could take. She began to position herself near Samuel during training, offering quiet advice, how to stand, how to breathe, how to see openings. Samuel listened with desperate gratitude, clinging to any kindness in this place of cruelty. Asher saw in him not just a frightened boy, but a symbol of everything slavery destroyed: innocence, childhood, hope, future. The night of June 27th arrived. The pit was packed with 193 spectators, including Judge Rutherford, Henry Beaumont, and Montgomery Whitfield, the holy trinity of monsters. The fight began at 9:30 in the evening. Moses entered the pit first, his massive frame intimidating in the torchlight. Then Samuel entered, looking impossibly small despite his recent growth. The boy's hands were shaking. The crowd laughed, entertained already by his visible fear. Blackwood raised his hand. The bell rang. The fight began. Moses charged, not with intent to kill, but with intent to end this quickly and spare the boy prolonged suffering. But Samuel panicked, stumbled backward, and fell. Moses loomed over him, prepared to pin him for a quick submission. The crowd booed, disappointed at the lack of spectacle. Blackwood frowned. Dutch cursed. And then Montgomery Whitfield stood up and shouted, "No submission! Fight to the death! I'll double the prize money!" The crowd roared approval. Blackwood smiled and nodded. Dutch rang the bell again, signaling the rule change. Moses looked up at the spectators with an expression of disbelief and grief. Samuel began to sob. By segment break, boo. What happened next would be debated in whispered conversations among New Orleans slaves for years afterward. Moses looked down at the crying boy, looked up at the crowd of wealthy white men demanding blood, and made a choice. He turned to face Blackwood directly, crossing his massive arms over his chest, and said in a voice that carried through the suddenly quiet arena, "No. I will not kill this child. Do what you will to me, but I will not give you this." The crowd went silent. Blackwood's face turned red. Dutch started toward the pit, and Asha, watching from the holding area behind an iron gate, felt something crystallize in her mind. This was the moment. This was the catalyst. This was when waiting ended and action began. Blackwood stood up, his voice shaking with rage. "You dare refuse me? You are property. You will obey or you will suffer in ways you cannot imagine." Moses remained still, arms crossed, face set. "I have suffered in ways you cannot imagine. Do your worst. I will not kill this boy." Blackwood turned to Dutch. "Bring the branding irons. We will teach this property a lesson about obedience." Dutch nodded and began walking toward the storage room where torture implements were kept. The crowd leaned forward, excited at this unexpected drama. Judge Rutherford was smiling. Henry Beaumont was already calculating how to market Moses's torture as entertainment. Montgomery Whitfield was lighting a fresh cigar. In the holding area, Asher turned to the other fighters who were waiting for possible later matches: Solomon, Jupiter, Samson, Rose, Dinah, Isaac, and 3 others. She looked at each of them and said quietly in English, speaking publicly for perhaps the 5th time in 9 years, "Tonight we take back our dignity. Tonight we stop being their entertainment. Tonight we fight for ourselves. Who stands with me?" The fighters stared at her. Solomon spoke first. "They will kill us." Asher nodded. "Yes, but we will take many of them with us, and we will die as warriors, not as slaves. Is that not better?" Samson, the gentle giant, looked at Moses standing defiant in the pit and said softly, "Yes, that is better." One by one, the others nodded. Rose smiled, a terrible smile. "I have been waiting 9 years for this." Dinah was crying, but nodding. "Finally it ends. One way or another, it ends." Asher began issuing orders with the calm authority of a military commander. "Jupiter, you are fastest. When I signal, you run to the weapons storage. Break the lock, distribute weapons. Solomon, you are smartest. You will retrieve Blackwood's keys when opportunity presents. Samson, you are strongest. You will break down the gates between us and the pit. The rest of you, follow my lead. We kill every white man in this building. We do not stop until they are all dead, or we are. Understood?" They nodded. Asher looked at the gate separating them from the pit, at Dutch returning with branding irons, at Blackwood standing imperious and confident, at the crowd of wealthy monsters waiting for suffering to entertain them. She looked at Moses, standing defiant, and Samuel crying on the sand, and she made a decision that would echo through history. She began to scream, not words, just a sound, a war cry from her Dahomey training, a sound she had not made in 9 years, a sound that carried in it all the rage of the Middle Passage, all the grief of her murdered sisters, all the fury of every enslaved person who had ever been forced to smile while dying inside. The sound froze everyone in place for a critical moment. Dutch turned, Blackwood turned, the crowd turned. And in that moment of distraction, Samson charged the gate. All 260 pounds of him, all his field-trained strength, all his gentleness transformed into violence. The gate was iron, but old, designed to hold slaves too broken to fight back. It was not designed to hold a man who had decided dying free was better than living in chains. The gate bent. The lock cracked. The gate flew open. The rebellion had begun. Asher was the first through the broken gate, moving with the fluid speed that had made her a legend in the pit. She vaulted over the pit wall, landing in the sand next to Moses and Samuel. Dutch was 10 feet away, holding branding irons, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. Asher did not give him time to react. She crossed the distance in 3 strides, ducked under his attempt to swing the branding irons at her, and drove her fist into his throat with surgical precision. The blow crushed his larynx. He dropped the irons, both hands going to his throat, his eyes wide with shock and the sudden understanding that he was dying. Asher caught one of the falling branding irons, still hot, and drove it into Dutch's left eye. He screamed, a wet, gurgling sound, and collapsed. She struck him twice more with the iron rod, crushing his skull, ensuring death. The first monster was dead. The crowd erupted into chaos. Some spectators were on their feet, reaching for pistols. Others were scrambling toward exits. Blackwood was shouting for guards. Judge Rutherford was frozen in his seat, his face pale. Henri Beaumont was trying to hide under a bench. Montgomery Whitfield had his pistol out, aiming toward the pit, but the fighters were already moving with coordinated precision. Jupiter had sprinted to the weapon storage, his speed catching the single guard there by surprise. Jupiter grabbed a hammer from a tool rack and crushed the guard's skull with one overhead blow before the man could draw his weapon. The guard dropped, dead, before he hit the floor. Jupiter broke open the weapon storage, a simple locked cabinet, by smashing the lock with the hammer. Inside were the weapons used for special exhibition matches: machetes, short swords, fighting knives, clubs, and even a pair of pistols kept for emergencies. Jupiter grabbed an armful of weapons and ran back toward the pit, distributing them as he went. Solomon received a machete, Rose got a knife, Samson took a club, Isaac grabbed a short sword, Dinah clutched a smaller blade, her hands shaking but her face set with determination, and Asher took a machete that felt almost exactly like the weapon she had carried in Dahomey. Perfectly balanced, edge sharp, weight familiar. She held it and felt 9 years of imposed helplessness fall away. She was a warrior again. She was Mino again. She was going to paint this place red. The guards stationed around the arena, 3 men total, were drawing pistols now. One fired toward the pit, the shot going wild, hitting the wall. The boom of the gunshot in the enclosed space was deafening, causing momentary paralysis. But Asher had trained in combat that included firearms. She did not freeze. She charged the nearest guard, covering 15 feet before he could fire a second time. She was below his aim, inside his reach, her machete moving in an upward arc that opened him from groin to sternum. His intestines spilled onto the floor. He looked down at them with an expression of confused horror, then collapsed. The second guard had his pistol out, but hesitated. scanning for a target in the chaos. That hesitation cost him his life. Rose, small and fast, darted low and drove her knife into his kidney from behind. He arched backward, screaming, and Rose pulled the knife free and stabbed him 7 more times in rapid succession, each blow accompanied by a grunt of effort and satisfaction. He fell, bleeding from 8 wounds, dying in the sawdust. The third guard was smarter or more cowardly. He ran toward an exit, abandoning his post. Samson caught him after 5 strides, grabbing him by the shoulder and spinning him around. The guard brought his pistol up, got the muzzle almost pointed at Samson's chest. Samson grabbed the pistol with his left hand, controlling it, and swung his club with his right hand. The blow caught the guard on the side of the head, with a sound like a melon splitting. The guard's skull caved in. He dropped instantly, killed so quickly he likely never felt it. Samson picked up the pistol, having no idea how to use it properly, but understanding instinctively that pointing the metal end at people might help. Now the arena was a slaughterhouse. The fighters had weapons. The guards were dead or fled, and before them were nearly 200 unarmed spectators, trapped in tiered seating with limited exits. The men who had spent years watching enslaved people kill each other for entertainment were about to experience the terror of being prey. Asha stood in the center of the pit, covered in Dutch's blood, holding her machete, and looked up at the crowd with the same expressionless face she had maintained for 9 years. Then she smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was a predator's smile. And she pointed her machete at Judge Rutherford in the front row, and said clearly, "Justice comes." The spectators stampeded. Nearly 200 men tried to reach 2 exits simultaneously, creating a bottleneck of panicked bodies. They trampled each other, pushed each other down, fought each other for position. The strong shoved the weak aside. The young climbed over the old. Every man for himself, and the fighters moved to block the exits. Solomon, intelligent and strategic, positioned himself at the main exit with his machete. Jupiter, fast and agile, took the secondary exit with a sword. Samson stood in the center with his club, ready to chase down anyone who broke through. Isaac, young and burning with rage at what had been done to him, guarded the entrance to the holding cells. Moses, still in the pit with Samuel, picked up Dutch's pistol, checked that it was loaded, and prepared to fire at any spectator who threatened the fighters. Rose and Dinah worked together, Rose using her knife and Dinah using her blade, cutting at the legs of any spectator who came within reach. Asha moved through the crowd like death incarnate. Her first target was Judge Rutherford, the man who had sentenced countless slaves to death, who had laughed when a mother was forced to watch her son die. Rutherford tried to hide behind other spectators, pushing them forward as human shields. Asha cut through them without hesitation. The first man she reached, a plantation owner from Baton Rouge whose name she did not know, received her machete across his chest, a diagonal slash that cut through his expensive suit, his ribs, and his lungs. He fell screaming, drowning in his own blood. The second man, another anonymous face in the crowd, tried to fight back, swinging his fists. She ducked his wild punch, stepped inside his reach, and drove her machete into his stomach, then ripped it sideways, disemboweling him. He dropped, trying to hold his intestines in, failing, dying in agony. Rutherford was backing toward a wall now, trapped, his silver hair disheveled, his face no longer granite, but terror. Asha approached him slowly, deliberately, letting him feel every second of helplessness. He tried to speak, to offer money, to beg, to bargain. "I can pay you. I can sign papers. I can set you free. Please." Asha stopped 3 feet from him and spoke for only the second time that night. "You sentenced my sister Rose to death for poisoning her mistress. Do you remember? You called her an animal. You said she was proof that slaves needed harsh discipline. You laughed when they hanged her. Do you remember?" Rutherford's face went even paler. I was following the law. I had no choice. I was just... Asha interrupted him. You always have a choice. You chose cruelty. Now live with the consequences. She drove her machete into his stomach, low and deep, then pulled it upward slowly, splitting him open from groin to sternum. Rutherford screamed, a high-pitched wail that cut through all other sounds. Asha held eye contact with him as she twisted the blade, ensuring maximum damage and maximum pain. She wanted him to suffer. She wanted him to understand, finally, what he had caused so many others to feel. When she pulled the machete free, his intestines spilled onto his expensive shoes. He looked down at them, still alive, still conscious, and whispered, "Please, kill me." Asha shook her head. "Die slow, like they did." She walked away, leaving him to bleed out over the next 11 minutes, conscious for most of them, suffering until the very end. Segment break. Henri Beaumont, the slave trader, was trying to hide under a bench when Rose found him. Beaumont was the one who had separated her from her 2 children, selling them to a plantation in Texas while keeping Rose in New Orleans. He had told her it was business, nothing personal, just economics. Rose grabbed him by his expensive coat and dragged him out from under the bench. He was crying, begging, offering everything he owned. Rose looked at him with no expression and said, "You told me I would forget my children. You told me time heals all wounds. You told me slaves do not feel pain like real people. Do you remember?" Beaumont was sobbing. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" Rose cut him off, literally slashing her knife across his mouth, cutting through his lips and teeth. He screamed, blood pouring from the wound. Rose stabbed him in the stomach, not deep enough to kill quickly, just deep enough to cause immense pain. Then she stabbed him again, and again, and again. 7 times she stabbed him, 1 for each year since he had taken her children, and with each stab she said, "Remember, remember, 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 remember." When she was finished, Beaumont was still alive but dying, bleeding from 7 stomach wounds, choking on his own blood and broken teeth. Rose spat on him and walked away. Montgomery Whitfield, the plantation owner from St. Charles Parish, was not hiding. He stood in the upper tier of seating with his pistol drawn, firing toward the fighters. He was a good shot, trained in dueling, comfortable with firearms. His first shot hit Solomon in the shoulder, spinning the older man around. His second shot missed Jupiter by inches. His third shot hit Rose in the leg, dropping her. Whitfield was reloading, his hands steady despite the chaos, when Asha reached him. She came up the tiers like a mountain cat, fast and fluid, covering ground in bounds. Whitfield saw her coming, abandoned his reload, and drew a knife from his boot. He was not unskilled with a blade. He had fought duels before. He slashed at Asha, a competent defensive strike. She parried it easily, her machete clanging against his knife. He struck again, faster, aiming for her throat. She blocked, deflected, and countered with a strike to his wrist that would have severed his hand if he had not pulled back. They circled each other on the narrow tier, Whitfield with his knife, Asha with her machete, the only 2 people in the arena genuinely trained in combat. Whitfield struck again, multiple quick slashes, trying to overwhelm her with speed. Asha gave ground, letting him advance, studying his pattern. He favored his right side. He dropped his guard slightly after each strike. He breathed through his mouth, getting tired. She waited for the perfect opening. It came after his 7th strike, when he overextended slightly, committed too much weight forward. Asha sidestepped, let his knife pass by her, and brought her machete down on his extended arm. The blade cut through his wrist completely, severing his hand. It fell to the floor, still gripping the knife. Whitfield stared at the stump of his arm, blood pulsing from the arteries, his face going white with shock. Asha did not give him time to process. She kicked him in the chest, sending him backward off the tier, falling 10 feet to the pit floor. He landed on his back, the impact knocking the air from his lungs, his severed wrist spraying blood with each heartbeat. Asher jumped down after him, landing gracefully in the sand beside him. Whitfield was trying to breathe, trying to speak, trying to comprehend what was happening. Asher knelt beside him and said quietly, "Your slaves on Whitfield Manor pray for your death every night. They tell stories of your cruelty to frighten children into obedience. They say you are the devil wearing a gentleman's face. Tonight, they will finally have answered prayers." Whitfield managed to gasp out, You are animals, all of you. This proves it." Asher smiled that terrible smile again. "If we are animals, what does that make you? Who created us? We learned cruelty from you. We learned violence from you. We learned that human life has no value from you. You taught us well." She raised her machete. Whitfield tried to scream, but his lungs would not fill. Asher brought the machete down on his neck. It took 3 strikes to sever his head completely, the blade cutting through vertebrae and tough tissue. When she finished, she picked up his head by the hair and held it up for the remaining spectators to see. Several men vomited. Several men fainted. All of them understood that they were going to die tonight. For the next hour and 47 minutes, the fighters systematically killed every spectator in the building. Some men fought back with fists or boots or whatever they could grab. None were trained fighters. None had experience with real violence. They were wealthy men who had watched violence from the safety of distance, never understanding that proximity changes everything. Moses, the blacksmith who had refused to kill a child, killed 7 men that night with Dutch's pistol and his bare hands. He felt no guilt. These men had applauded death for entertainment. They received what they had celebrated. Solomon, despite his shoulder wound, killed 3 men with his machete, using intelligence and positioning to compensate for reduced mobility. He targeted the ones trying to organize resistance, cutting down leadership before it could form. Jupiter, the fastest among them, killed 9 men, chasing down those who tried to flee, cutting them down in hallways or at locked doors. He did not make it quick. He had spent 3 years in the pit, forced to fight for the amusement of these men. He remembered every humiliation, every wound, every moment of degradation. He made them pay slowly. Samson, despite his gentle nature, killed 6 men with his club, each blow struck with enough force to shatter skulls. He cried while doing it, tears streaming down his face, but he did not stop. These men had created a world where gentleness was beaten out of people or people were beaten to death. He would not let them continue. Isaac, the youngest fighter, killed 4 men. He was not as skilled as the others, not as strong, not as experienced. But he had rage that compensated for inexperience. These were the men who had bought and sold his mother, who had used her body to produce more slaves, who had taken him from her and thrown him into this pit to die for their entertainment. He killed messily, inefficiently, but thoroughly. Rose, despite her leg wound, killed 5 men, crawling after them when she could not walk, stabbing at ankles and legs until they fell, then cutting throats. She had learned efficiency in the pit. She applied those lessons now. Dinah killed 2 men, both times crying while doing it, both times apologizing to God, even as the blade struck. She was too good for this world of violence. But this world had given her no choice. And Asher killed 18 men that night. She moved through the arena like the warrior she had been trained to be, identifying threats, neutralizing them. Moving to the next target, efficient and relentless. She did not kill for pleasure. She killed for justice. Each man who fell had been complicit in the pit's existence. Each man who fell had wagered on human suffering. Each man who fell had looked at enslaved people and seen property rather than human beings. She gave them the same consideration they had given her people, none. By 11:47 at night, 33 men were dead in the pit. The floor was covered in blood, body parts, and the remnants of wealth that meant nothing in death. Expensive suits were torn and soaked red. Gold watch chains were tangled in intestines. Diamond cufflinks sparkled on severed hands. The torches still burned, casting the same flickering light they always had. Indifferent to the transformation of the space from arena to abattoir, the fighters stood among the carnage, some wounded, all exhausted, all covered in blood, all finally free of the weight that had pressed down on them for years. They had taken back their dignity, they had stopped being entertainment, they had fought for themselves, and now they had to decide what came next. Asha stood in the center of the pit, her machete still in her hand, her breathing heavy but controlled, her mind already moving to the next phase. She looked at the other fighters. Moses was checking on Samuel, the boy who had somehow survived unharmed in the chaos, protected by the very man who had refused to kill him. Solomon was binding his shoulder wound with strips torn from a dead man's expensive shirt. Jupiter was searching bodies for weapons and valuables. Samson was sitting on a bench, his club across his knees, still crying. Rose was binding her leg wound, her face set with grim determination. Dinah was praying, kneeling in blood, asking forgiveness for what she had been forced to do. Isaac was staring at his hands, unable to process what he had just done. Asha addressed them in English, her voice carrying the authority that came from 9 years of earned respect and ancient warrior training. "We have won a battle, but we have not won freedom. Within hours, maybe less, someone will discover what happened here. The city will mobilize. They will send militias, slave patrols, police, everyone. We cannot fight an entire city. We have 3 choices. First, we can flee individually, scatter, try to reach the north or the swamps, hope that in chaos some of us survive. Second, we can stay here, fortify this position, make them come to us, sell our lives dearly and take as many of them with us as we can. Third, we can take this fight beyond these walls, strike at symbols of slavery in this city, maximize our impact before death comes." She paused, letting them consider. "I am a warrior. I will fight until I can fight no more. But you are not warriors. You are survivors forced into violence. The choice is yours. I will not command you." Moses spoke first, his deep voice calm despite the bloodshed. "I spent 15 years in chains before the pit. I spent 3 years in this hell. I have no family left. They were sold away years ago. I have nothing to return to and nowhere to go. If this is my last night alive, I would rather spend it fighting those who put me here than running from them. I stay and fight." Solomon nodded agreement. "I can read, I can write. I know that makes me dangerous to them. If I run, I will be caught within days. If I stay, I can ensure this story is documented. Someone must survive to tell what happened here. But until I am the last alive, I fight." Jupiter smiled, a wild, reckless smile. "I am fast, faster than slave catchers, faster than patrols. But I know these streets now. I know where the slave traders live, where the auction houses are, where the overseers drink. If we have one night of freedom before death, let us make it a night this city never forgets. I am with Asha. We take the fight to them." Samson looked up, his gentle face hardened by the night's violence. "I killed 6 men tonight. I can never return to the man I was. Forward is the only direction left. I stand with the group." Isaac, young and uncertain, looked to Asha for guidance. She nodded at him, giving permission to choose his own path. He straightened his shoulders and said, "They killed my childhood. They killed my innocence. They killed any chance I had at a normal life. I have been dead for weeks already. Tonight, I became alive again. I will not return to being dead. I fight." Rose, pragmatic despite her wounds, assessed the situation. "I am injured. I will slow any escape, but I can still fight. Give me a position to defend, and I will hold it until I cannot. Use me as you see fit." Dinah, still on her knees, looked up at Asha with tears in her eyes. "I am afraid. I am so afraid. But I am more afraid of going back to chains than I am of dying free. I will stay. I will fight. God forgive me, but I will fight." That left only Samuel, the 15-year-old boy whose refusal to fight had started this rebellion. All eyes turned to him. He was still shaking, still processing, still a child despite everything that had happened. Moses spoke gently to him. "Boy, you did not ask for any of this. You have no blood on your hands. If anyone has a chance to escape, it is you. You are young, you are unknown in this city. You could blend in, find help, survive. We will cover your escape if you choose to run." Samuel looked at Moses, at Asher, at the others. Then he looked at the bodies of the men who would have forced him to kill or be killed for their amusement. He picked up a knife from the floor, held it with shaking hands, and said quietly, "My mama told me before they took me that I should survive, that survival was victory. But mama never saw this place. She never knew that sometimes surviving is not enough. Sometimes you have to fight, even if you lose, just to prove you are human. I stay." Asha nodded slowly, respect in her eyes. "Then we stay together. We fight together. We die together if necessary, but we die as warriors, not as slaves." Segment break day. Asha began organizing them with military precision. They barricaded the main entrance to the pit, using benches, bodies, and anything else that could slow attackers. They positioned fighters at strategic points, creating overlapping fields of fire for the 2 pistols they had. They distributed the remaining weapons, ensuring everyone had something. They searched the bodies for useful items, finding 4 more pistols, ammunition, money that was worthless to them but might buy aid from unexpected sources, and documents that Solomon immediately began reading, looking for useful intelligence. They found food and water in Blackwood's private office, stores meant for him but now sustaining the fighters. They found medical supplies, basic but sufficient to properly bind wounds. They found keys to the cells, which they used to free any prisoners in the holding area, though fortunately all fighters had been part of the rebellion. But Asha knew defense was temporary. The pit was a trap if they only waited. She proposed a modified plan that combined defense with offense. A small group would remain to hold the pit as long as possible, creating a symbol of resistance. But another group would venture out into the city to strike at specific targets, symbols of the slave system that kept hundreds of thousands in bondage. If they were to die tonight, let them die in a way that would echo through history. Let them die in a way that would inspire others. Let them die in a way that the system could never fully suppress or erase. She divided them into 2 groups. The hold group would consist of Moses, Samson, Rose with her injured leg, and young Samuel. They would defend the pit, make the authorities pay for every inch, and hopefully buy time for the strike group. The strike group would be Asher, Solomon, Jupiter, Isaac, and Dinah. They would move through the city, hitting specific targets that Asher had learned about over 9 years of listening to spectator conversations. First target was Henry Beaumont's slave auction house, 3 blocks away, where human beings were sold every Tuesday. Second target was the home of Judge Rutherford, where documents related to slave trials might be found and destroyed. Third target was Montgomery Whitfield's townhouse in the French Quarter, where he kept slaves when visiting the city. Each target would send a message. Each target would hurt the system. Each target would justify their deaths. They prepared to move out at 12:30 in the morning. Before they left, Asha addressed the hold group. "You are buying us time and creating a symbol. When they find this place, when they see what we have done, they will panic. Use that panic. Make them afraid. Make them cautious. Every minute you hold is another minute we can strike. If we all die tonight, let us at least die knowing we hurt them in ways they cannot ignore." Moses gripped her hand in a warrior's clasp. "We will hold. You strike hard. Make them bleed." Asha nodded. turned to her strike group and said simply, "Follow me." They exited the pit through a back entrance that led into the cooperage above, then out into a side alley. It was after midnight, on what was now July 5th. The streets of the French Quarter were not empty. Even this late, sailors and drunks and prostitutes and night workers were still about, but the group moved through shadows, avoiding attention. They were still covered in blood, but in the darkness of the alley and the chaos of late-night New Orleans, they were just more darkness among darkness. Solomon had grabbed a jacket from Blackwood's office, expensive and blood-stained, but sufficient to cover his wounds. The others wore what they had fought in, the simple clothes of slaves, now thoroughly stained red. They reached Henri Beaumont's slave auction house at 12:53 in the morning. The building was a two-story structure on Chartres Street, brick construction with a large open room on the ground floor where auctions were held and offices on the second floor where sales were finalized. It was locked and dark at this hour. No guards, because who would attack a slave auction house in the middle of a slave city? Jupiter picked the lock, a skill he had learned in his previous life before enslavement. The door opened with a quiet click. They entered silently, weapons ready. The auction room was cold and impersonal, just a raised platform, benches for buyers, and shackles mounted on the walls where slaves would be displayed. Asha looked at those shackles and remembered stories she had heard from other fighters, of families torn apart on this very platform, of children sold away from mothers, of husbands separated from wives, of human beings reduced to prices and pounds and marketability. She felt no hesitation about what came next. Solomon found the office where records were kept, ledgers documenting 10 years of sales, thousands of human beings reduced to entries in books. He began piling the ledgers, along with any other papers he could find. Isaac found lamp oil used for the building's lighting. They doused the ledgers, the furniture, the platform, everything that would burn. Dinah found something that made her stop and stare. On a wall in the office were daguerreotype photographs of successful sales, wealthy buyers posing with their new property, smiling for the camera while chained humans stood beside them with dead eyes. There were 43 photographs. Dinah began tearing them down one by one, throwing them into the pile of oil-soaked documents. Let them burn. Let every image of this evil burn. When the pile was ready, Asha struck a match, one of several they had taken from the pit, and dropped it onto the oil-soaked paper. The fire caught immediately, spreading fast, feeding on lamp oil and 10 years of documented evil. They left the auction house as flames began to spread to the walls and ceiling. By the time they reached the end of the block, fire was visible in the windows. By the time they reached their next target, the auction house was fully engulfed, flames reaching into the night sky, visible across the French Quarter. Someone would sound the alarm. Fire brigades would respond, but the building would be destroyed, and with it records that could never be reconstructed. Every ledger that burned was a severed connection between families trying to find each other after sale. That was tragic. But every ledger that burned was also evidence of crimes that would never face justice. That was acceptable. Let it burn. Let it all burn. The second target was Judge Rutherford's home, a mansion in the Garden District, requiring a longer journey but worth the risk. They moved through streets, rapidly emptying, as word spread of a major fire in the French Quarter. Fire bells were ringing. People were running toward Chartres Street. The confusion provided cover. They reached the Garden District at 1:37 in the morning. Rutherford's mansion was a 3-story Greek revival structure. White columns, manicured gardens, wrought iron fencing, the very picture of southern gentility built on the foundation of slavery. The house was dark, but not empty. Rutherford had lived alone since his wife's death 3 years earlier, attended by 6 house slaves who had keys and permission to lock doors, but never to leave the property. Jupiter scouted the perimeter and found a servant's entrance at the rear, locked but accessible. He picked this lock as well, faster now with practice. They entered into a kitchen that smelled of recent cooking, bread and coffee and ham. The house slaves would be asleep in the attic, as was common for servants in these grand homes. Asher decided not to wake them or involve them. These slaves had done nothing wrong. They were victims as much as the fighters. Let them sleep. Let them claim ignorance when authorities questioned them later. Solomon led them to Rutherford's study on the second floor, a room he guessed would contain legal documents. The guess was correct. The study was lined with bookshelves containing law books, historical texts, and personal records. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with pending cases and legal opinions. Solomon began searching systematically, looking for anything related to slave trials or legal decisions that had condemned people to death. He found them quickly. Rutherford had kept meticulous records, perhaps prideful documentation of his role in maintaining the slave system. There were case files, trial transcripts, execution orders, legal opinions defending the institution of slavery, correspondence with other judges about maintaining discipline among the enslaved population, and even a personal journal documenting Rutherford's thoughts on the inferiority of black people. Solomon read a page of the journal, and his hands began to shake with rage. Listen to this. July 12, 1855. Presided over the trial of the negress called Rose today. She poisoned her mistress with arsenic, a vile and calculated crime proving the savage nature lurking beneath the veneer of domestication. I sentenced her to hang, which she will do next Thursday. I feel no remorse. These creatures must be reminded constantly of their place, lest they forget and believe themselves equal to their betters. The execution will serve as an excellent example. He is talking about Rose, our Rose. He called her savage. He called her creature. Solomon's voice broke. He felt no remorse. Asher took the journal from Solomon gently. Then let us feel no remorse either. Burn it. Burn it all. Let his legacy be ash. They piled everything burnable in the center of the study. Books and documents and papers and furniture. They soaked it with lamp oil from the study's own lamps. Isaac found something in a locked drawer of the desk, a collection of what appeared to be trophies, small personal items taken from executed slaves, a carved wooden bird, a lock of hair tied with string, a small cloth doll, a cracked button, souvenirs of death. Isaac stared at these items with horror and fury. He collected them. He kept pieces of the people he killed like trophies. He threw the entire collection into the pile. Burn them. Burn his memory. Burn everything he was. But before they set the fire, Asher had one more act to complete in this house. She walked to the front door, opened it, and went outside to the mansion's front facade. There she used blood still wet on her machete to write a message on the white column beside the door. 2 words in letters 3 feet high, easily visible from the street. Justice comes. Then she returned inside, struck a match, and dropped it onto the oil-soaked pile. The fire roared to life, spreading faster than the auction house because this building was older, the wood drier, the furnishings more expensive and more flammable. They exited through the rear as the study became an inferno. By the time they reached the street, flames were visible through second-floor windows. By the time they reached the French Quarter, Rutherford's mansion was a beacon of fire visible across the city. The third target was Montgomery Whitfield's townhouse, but they never reached it. As they moved through the streets at 2:13 in the morning, they heard what they had been dreading. Alarm bells ringing not for fire but for mobilization, the deep tolling pattern that meant crisis, that meant assemble the militia, that meant slave rebellion. Someone had found the pit. Someone had discovered 33 dead white men and the missing fighters. The city was waking to its nightmare. Within minutes, the streets began to fill with armed men, militiamen grabbing rifles, slave patrols mounting horses, police officers organizing search parties, and ordinary citizens joining impromptu posses. The window for striking additional targets had closed. Asher made a command decision. They would return to the pit, rejoin the hold group, and make their final stand together. Dying separately achieved nothing. Dying together created a unified story, a single narrative that would be harder for the system to distort or erase. They moved through back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares, now filling with armed searchers. They were 3 blocks from the pit when they encountered their first patrol. 5 men with rifles and a bloodhound. The dog scented them immediately, baying loud enough to wake the dead. The 5 men raised their rifles. Asher did not give them time to fire. She charged directly at the nearest man, closing the distance before he could aim properly, her machete cutting upward into his groin and then his chest. He screamed and fell. Jupiter was on the second man instantly, his sword taking the man in the throat, blood spraying in an arterial arc. Solomon, despite his wounded shoulder, engaged the third man, deflecting the rifle barrel aside and driving his machete into the man's stomach. The man tried to scream, but only blood came out. Isaac and Dinah targeted the 4th man together, Isaac going high with his sword, Dinah going low with her knife. The combined attack overwhelming him, he fell with Isaac's blade in his chest and Dinah's knife in his kidney. The 5th man, smarter or more cowardly than his companions, ran instead of fighting. He got 20 feet before Jupiter caught him, tackling him to the ground and stabbing him repeatedly in the back until the struggle stopped. But the damage was done. The gunfire and screams had alerted every patrol within 3 blocks. They could hear shouting, running feet, horses galloping. They had minutes at best. Asher ordered them to move, fast, abandoning stealth for speed. They sprinted the remaining 3 blocks to the pit, occasionally glimpsing pursuit behind them, occasionally hearing shots fired in their direction, none hitting in the darkness and chaos. They reached the pit at 2:34 in the morning. The door was still barricaded from inside. Asher pounded on it, shouting, "Moses, it is Asher, open!" A moment later the barricade began to move, and the door opened just enough for them to slip through before being resealed. Moses greeted them with relief. "We heard the alarm bells. We feared you were caught." Asher shook her head. "Not caught, hunted, but we made them pay. Beaumont's auction house is ash. Rutherford's mansion is burning. We killed 5 more in the streets. How many came here?" Segment break. Moses reported that approximately 30 minutes earlier, around 2 o'clock in the morning, a night watchman had discovered the pit. He had likely been investigating the fire at the auction house, noticed the cooperage door ajar, and investigated. He had found the carnage. He had fled immediately, running screaming into the street. Since then no one had approached. But Moses had heard movement outside, voices giving orders, horses being positioned, the sounds of a force assembling. The authorities were preparing to storm the pit, but they were being cautious, not knowing how many fighters remained inside or how well armed they were. Caution was buying time. Time was running out. The final battle was about to begin. Asher surveyed their situation. They had 11 fighters, herself, Solomon, Moses, Jupiter, Samson, Isaac, Rose, Dinah, and Samuel. Rose was injured but mobile. Solomon was wounded but functional. The rest were exhausted and battered but still capable. They had 6 pistols with limited ammunition, approximately 23 shots total, based on Moses's count of the powder and ball they had found. They had bladed weapons, machetes, swords, knives. They had a defensible position with limited entry points. They had barricades. They had darkness. The torches had burned low, and they deliberately did not relight them, giving them advantage of knowing the terrain, while attackers would be entering blind. But against them was an entire city. New Orleans in 1857 had a population of over 168,000 people. Even accounting for the fact that half were enslaved and would not participate in the attack. That left over 80,000 free residents, and even if only a tiny fraction mobilized, the fighters were facing hundreds of armed men. They had no path to victory. They had no path to survival. What they had was the ability to choose how they died. And that, Asha knew, was more freedom than they had possessed in years. She gathered the fighters in the center of the pit, the same space where they had been forced to fight each other for entertainment, now the space where they would make their final stand together. She spoke to them clearly, ensuring everyone understood what was coming. Outside that door is an army. We are 11. We cannot win. We cannot escape. We will die here, but we will die as warriors, not as slaves. We will die fighting, not begging. We will die having struck a blow against this evil system that will echo through history. Your names will be remembered. Your courage will inspire others. Your deaths will have meaning. Is there anyone who wishes to surrender, to take their chances with mercy from the courts? I will not judge you. Survival is its own victory. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Samuel, the 15-year-old boy, stepped forward. I have been free for 3 hours. It is not enough, but it is more than I had yesterday. If I die now, I die free. That is enough. One by one, the others voiced agreement. They would stand together. They would fight together. They would die together if necessary, but they would not surrender. They would not beg. They would not give the system the satisfaction of breaking them before death. Asha organized the defense. She positioned the pistols at critical points, giving them to the best shots, Moses, Solomon, and herself. The others would use bladed weapons, holding choke points where firearms would be less effective than close combat. She had Jupiter positioned at the main entrance with his sword, his speed perfect for the confined space. She had Samson at the secondary entrance with his club, his strength ideal for blocking the narrow doorway. She had Rose and Dinah positioned to protect wounded or provide backup wherever needed. She had Isaac watching their rear, ensuring no one entered through unexpected routes. She kept Samuel near her, not for his combat effectiveness, but to protect him as long as possible. He had been forced into this. He deserved whatever mercy she could provide. At 3:11 in the morning, the attack began. A voice outside called for their surrender, offering trial and legal process. Asha responded by firing her pistol through the door, the ball punching through wood and eliciting a scream from someone beyond. That was her answer. There would be no surrender. The authorities responded with gunfire, multiple rifles firing into the barricaded door, splintering wood, ricocheting off brick, forcing the defenders to take cover. Then came the sound of something heavy being brought to bear, a battering ram, improvised from a timber, crashing into the door with tremendous force. The barricade shook but held. Another blow, another. The door cracked but did not break. Moses called out, "Let them through! Let them enter the kill zone." Asha agreed. They pulled back from the door, taking positions behind cover, allowing the door to break, drawing the attackers into prepared defensive positions. After the 9th blow from the battering ram, the door exploded inward, the barricade collapsing, and armed men poured through. They came in a rush, a dozen men with rifles and pistols, expecting to overwhelm with numbers. They entered directly into a slaughter. Moses fired his pistol at point-blank range into the first man through the door, the ball taking him in the face, killing him instantly. The body fell, blocking the entrance momentarily. The second man tripped over the body. Jupiter's sword took him in the throat as he stumbled. The third man made it 3 steps before Solomon's machete opened his chest. The fourth man fired his rifle wildly, hitting nothing, and was tackled by Samson and beaten to death with the club. The initial rush broke on the defenders' positions like a wave on rocks. 7 men entered. 7 men died in less than 30 seconds. The attackers pulled back, the doorway now blocked by bodies, blood making the floor treacherous. There was a pause. Shouted orders from outside, reorganization. The defenders used the time to reload pistols and reposition. Asha knew the next assault would be more organized, more careful. The authorities now understood they were facing fighters who knew what they were doing. The second assault came at 3:29, this time with covering fire. Riflemen outside fired through windows and the broken door, providing suppression while a new group rushed in. This group was better, moving tactically, using cover, coordinating their attack. They got farther into the arena before the defenders engaged them. A brutal close-quarters battle erupted, gunfire and blade work in darkness, lit only by the muzzle flashes of rifles. Moses shot one attacker in the chest. Solomon cut down another. Jupiter wounded a third, who retreated screaming, but the defenders paid a price. Isaac took a ball in the stomach. The impact lifting him off his feet and slamming him against a wall. He slid down, leaving a blood trail, both hands pressed to the wound. Dinah rushed to him, trying to staunch the bleeding, but the wound was fatal. Isaac looked up at her with wide, confused eyes and whispered, "I do not want to die." Then he did, bleeding out in less than 2 minutes, his young life ending in the same pit where it had nearly ended days before. The second assault was repelled, but at cost. The defenders now numbered 10. Isaac's death hardened their resolve, but also revealed their mortality. They were not invincible. They were human. They could be killed, and they would be. It was only a matter of time. The third assault came at 3:48, larger and more coordinated. Over 20 men rushed the entrance simultaneously, too many to stop with pistol fire, too many to cut down before they reached defensive positions. The defenders were forced back, giving ground, fighting desperately. Jupiter killed 3 men before a rifle ball shattered his left arm, forcing him to switch his sword to his weaker hand. Samson crushed 2 skulls with his club before being shot twice in the chest, the impact staggering him but not dropping him immediately. He fought on for another 30 seconds, killing 1 more attacker before a third shot took him in the head, and he fell like a great tree, his gentle soul finally released from this violent world. Moses ran out of ammunition and was forced into hand-to-hand combat against 2 attackers with bayonets. He disarmed one and beat him to death with his own rifle, but the second bayonet caught him in the side, a deep, stabbing wound that punctured his lung. Moses ripped the bayonet out, turned it on its owner, and drove it into the man's eye before collapsing, drowning in his own blood. Rose and Dinah fought together, Rose hampered by her leg wound, but still effective with her knife, Dinah crying and praying while stabbing anyone who came close. An attacker shot Rose in the head at close range, killing her instantly. Dinah screamed and threw herself at the shooter, driving her knife into his chest 5 times before another attacker shot her in the back. She fell across Rose's body, the 2 women who had suffered so much finally finding peace together. That left Solomon, Jupiter with his shattered arm, Samuel and Asher. 4 defenders against an entire city. Solomon was out of ammunition and bleeding from multiple wounds. Jupiter could barely lift his sword. Samuel was armed but terrified, his brief hours of courage exhausted. And Asher was bleeding from a grazing wound across her ribs and a deeper cut on her left thigh. They were surrounded, low on weapons, exhausted and dying, but they were not broken. Asher looked at the 3 men with her and said simply, "It has been an honor." They nodded. They understood. This was the end. Make it count. The 4th assault came at 4:06 in the morning. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside, this assault was not a rush, but a slow, methodical advance, armed men moving carefully, using cover, overwhelming with numbers and firepower. The defenders fought with everything they had left. Solomon wielded his machete until a rifle ball took him in the throat, killing him instantly. Jupiter fought one-handed until blood loss from his shattered arm caused him to collapse, where he was bayoneted multiple times. Samuel, the boy who had started this rebellion by refusing to fight, finally fell, protecting Asher, taking a ball meant for her, dying with a confused expression as if unable to understand how his life had led to this moment. And then there was only Asher. Surrounded by 40 men with rifles and bayonets, covered in blood, some hers, most belonging to others, her machete still in her hand, her warrior's pride still intact. The men circled her cautiously, having learned to respect her lethality. She could have attacked, forced them to kill her in combat. Instead, she did something they did not expect. She dropped her machete, not in surrender but in completion. She had done what she came to do. She had fought. She had struck back. She had hurt them. That was enough. The men rushed in, tackling her, beating her, shackling her wrists and ankles with heavy chains. They dragged her out of the pit into the dawn light of July 5th, 1857. The street was filled with hundreds of armed men, militia and police, and civilian posses. Behind them were crowds of white citizens who had come to see the captured rebels. And behind them, kept at a distance by patrols, were enslaved people who had heard whispers of what happened, who looked at Asha being dragged in chains and saw something they had almost forgotten: resistance, defiance, dignity in the face of overwhelming power. Asha was thrown into a wagon and transported to the parish prison, a brick structure on Orleans Street that housed criminals and runaway slaves awaiting trial or punishment. She was placed in a cell by herself, the authorities afraid she might inspire other prisoners. Her wounds were treated, not out of mercy, but because they wanted her healthy enough to stand trial and be executed publicly. For 3 weeks she remained in that cell, visited only by guards bringing food and a priest attempting to save her soul. She refused confession. She refused repentance. When the priest asked if she regretted her actions, she looked at him with eyes that had seen the Middle Passage, the pit, and the liberation of slaughter, and said clearly, "I regret only that I did not kill more." The trial of Asha, held in late July of 1857, was a spectacle. The courthouse was packed with spectators, all white, all eager to see the woman who had led the deadliest slave rebellion in New Orleans history. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: 33 dead white men, numerous wounded survivors who testified to the carnage, physical evidence from the scene. The defense, a court-appointed attorney who seemed afraid of his own client, argued that Asha had been driven mad by the conditions in the pit, that she was not fully responsible for her actions, that execution would make her a martyr. The jury, 12 white men, deliberated for 17 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. The judge, a colleague of the late Nathaniel Rutherford, sentenced her to death by hanging, to be carried out on August 15th, 1857. In the 3 weeks between sentencing and execution, Asha became a symbol. To white society, she represented their deepest fears: the enslaved rising up, killing their masters, burning the institutions of slavery. Laws were passed restricting slave movement further. Patrols were increased. Security around slave quarters was tightened. The slave system, momentarily shocked, responded by becoming even more oppressive. But to enslaved people throughout Louisiana and eventually throughout the South, Asha became something else: proof that resistance was possible. Proof that dignity could be maintained even in chains. Proof that one person could strike a blow that would echo through history. Her name was whispered in spirituals. Her story was told in hush harbors, where slaves gathered to worship in secret. Her courage inspired others. Segment break. On the morning of August 15th, 1857, exactly 1 month and 10 days after the rebellion, Asha was taken from her cell, placed in a wagon, and transported to Congo Square, the traditional execution site for rebellious slaves. A scaffold had been erected in the center of the square. Surrounding it were over 2,000 spectators, whites who came to see justice done, and slaves who were forced to attend as a warning. Asha was led up the scaffold steps in chains, her head held high, her face expressionless. The executioner read the charges and the sentence. A preacher made a final plea for her soul. She ignored him. She looked out over the crowd, seeing the faces of enslaved people forced to watch, and she spoke her final words loudly enough for all to hear. "I am Asha of the Mino, warrior of Dahomey, daughter of the warrior women who have fought oppression for generations. I was captured, I was enslaved, I was forced to fight and kill for the entertainment of evil men. On July 4th, 1857, I chose freedom. I chose dignity. I chose to fight back. I killed 33 men who profited from slavery. I regret only that I could not kill more. To my people watching, do not mourn me. I die as I lived in my homeland, as a warrior. I die free in my mind and my spirit, even if my body is in chains. They can kill me, but they cannot break me. Remember this. Remember that one woman with a machete and the courage to use it killed 33 oppressors. Remember that resistance is always possible. Remember that we are human beings, not property. Remember me. Remember us all, and when the time comes, finish what we started." The executioner placed the noose around her neck. Asha looked directly at the enslaved people in the crowd and smiled. A genuine smile, the first real smile she had allowed herself in 9 years. Then the trapdoor opened. She dropped. Her neck broke instantly. She died quickly, without suffering. A mercy she had not shown her enemies and did not deserve herself, but mercy noneth. Her body was left hanging for 3 hours as a warning before being cut down and buried in an unmarked grave in a pauper's cemetery outside the city. The authorities wanted her forgotten, wanted her story erased, wanted her to become just another dead slave lost to history, but they failed. Stories of Asha and the Pitt Rebellion spread through the Underground Railroad network. Abolitionists in the North heard the tale and wrote about it, calling her the Gladiator of Louisiana, a woman warrior who struck a blow for freedom. Frederick Douglass mentioned her in a speech in 1859, saying, "The woman who led the rebellion in New Orleans proved that the enslaved will fight when given the chance, that they are not content with bondage, that they are human beings with the same desire for liberty that beats in all hearts." Harriet Tubman, upon hearing the story, reportedly said, "She did what many wish they had the courage to do. She fought back. That is what warriors do." In Louisiana, the rebellion had immediate effects. The pit was destroyed, filled with earth and built over, erased physically, but never forgotten. Illegal fighting arenas throughout the South closed temporarily, their operators terrified of similar uprisings. Security around slave quarters was increased drastically, but so too was paranoia among slave owners. They looked at their house slaves and field hands and saw not property but potential rebels. They slept with weapons within reach. They created elaborate security procedures. They lived in fear, and fear was, in its own way, a form of justice. The comfortable certainty that slaves were content with their bondage was shattered. Every slave owner in the South after July 4th, 1857, knew that beneath the surface, compliance might lurk rage waiting for opportunity. The rebellion also inspired others. In October of 1857, a slave named Daniel, on a plantation near Baton Rouge, poisoned his owner and 2 overseers before escaping north. He was never caught. In December of the same year, a group of field hands on a Mississippi plantation rose up during the night, killed 4 overseers, and burned the plantation house before fleeing into the swamps. Most were caught and executed, but 3 made it to freedom. In March of 1858, a house slave in Mobile, Alabama, named Sarah, killed her mistress with a kitchen knife and escaped, leaving a note that read simply, "Remember Asha." She too was never caught. These were not isolated incidents inspired directly and solely by Asha's rebellion, but they were part of a pattern: increased resistance, increased willingness to use violence, increased understanding that death fighting was preferable to life in chains. The system of slavery depended on the enslaved believing resistance was futile, that submission was survival, that accepting bondage was wisdom. Asha shattered that belief. She proved resistance was possible. She proved that even one person could hurt the system. She proved that choosing death over dishonor was valid. And that proof spread like fire through dry timber, impossible to fully contain, burning in the hearts of thousands who heard her story. The physical evidence of the rebellion was erased, but the psychological impact could not be erased. The plantation owners and overseers and slave traders who survived the night of July 4th, 1857, carried scars both physical and mental. They jumped at shadows. They suspected every enslaved person. They increased security measures to absurd levels, and still they feared. Because Asha had taught them that they were not safe, that their power was not absolute, that the people they had brutalized might one day brutalize them in return. That fear, that constant gnawing anxiety, was Asha's true legacy. She had weaponized fear, turning it from a tool of oppression into a consequence of oppression. The masters now feared their slaves as much as the slaves had feared their masters. Balance of a terrible sort had been achieved. For the enslaved community in New Orleans and beyond, Asha became a legend. Her story was told and retold, embellished and mythologized. In some versions, she killed 100 men. In some versions, she escaped and lived free in the north. In some versions, she was a princess in Africa before her capture. The details varied, but the core remained constant. She was a warrior who fought back. She was a woman who refused to be broken. She was a symbol of resistance and dignity. Mothers told the story to daughters. Fathers told it to sons. It was passed down through generations, preserved in oral tradition long after the written records were deliberately destroyed or lost. The 11 fighters who died in the pit were initially buried in unmarked graves, the authorities wanting them forgotten. But the enslaved community remembered. They knew where the graves were. They visited them secretly, leaving small offerings, stones and flowers and carved wood. They sang spirituals over the graves, songs that sounded like mourning but contained coded messages of resistance and hope. And eventually, after the Civil War and the end of slavery, some of those graves were marked with proper headstones, funded by freed people who wanted to honor those who had fought before freedom came. The official history of New Orleans rarely mentions the Pitt Rebellion. Historical records were sanitized, minimizing the event or omitting it entirely. White historians, when forced to acknowledge it, portrayed it as a criminal incident rather than a rebellion, individual madness rather than systemic resistance. They wanted to control the narrative, to prevent the rebellion from inspiring others, to maintain the fiction that slavery was a benign institution accepted by the enslaved. But oral histories preserved the truth. Black communities in Louisiana and throughout the South kept the story alive, passing it from generation to generation, ensuring that Asha and her warriors would not be forgotten. In the modern era, historians have attempted to reconstruct what happened on July 4th, 1857. Court records provide some details, trial transcripts and execution documents. Newspaper accounts from the period offer contemporary descriptions, though filtered through racist perspectives that portrayed the fighters as animals rather than freedom fighters. Archaeological investigations of the site where the pit stood have uncovered physical evidence. Bones showing signs of violent death, artifacts from the arena, proof that the stories were based in truth. But the most valuable sources remain the oral histories, stories passed down through families, preserved in communities, protected from the erasure that authorities attempted. What can we learn from the Pitt Rebellion? What does Asha's story teach us more than 160 years later? First, it teaches us that oppression inevitably creates resistance. You cannot brutalize people indefinitely without consequence. The more extreme the oppression, the more violent the resistance will eventually become. Second, it teaches us that resistance is always possible, even in the most restrictive circumstances. Asha was enslaved, forced to fight, constantly watched, and yet she found a way to strike back. Third, it teaches us that individuals matter. One woman with courage and intelligence orchestrated a rebellion that killed 33 oppressors and terrified an entire city. Individual agency, even in systems designed to eliminate it, persists. Fourth, it teaches us about the cost of dignity. Asha and her fellow fighters knew they would die. They chose to fight anyway because dying free was better than living enslaved. That choice, that prioritization of dignity over survival, is both inspiring and heartbreaking. But perhaps the most important lesson is about memory and erasure. The system that enslaved Asha tried desperately to erase her story, to bury the rebellion, to prevent it from inspiring others. They failed because communities refused to forget. Oral tradition preserved what written records tried to eliminate. This teaches us that telling these stories, remembering these histories, honoring these freedom fighters is itself an act of resistance against systems that want certain narratives forgotten. Every time we tell Asha's story, we defeat the erasure. Every time we remember the fighters who died in the pit, we honor their sacrifice. Every time we acknowledge the brutality of slavery and the courage of those who resisted, we push back against comfortable myths about American history. The legacy of the Pitt Rebellion extends beyond history into the present. The same systems of oppression that existed in 1857, though transformed and evolved, still exist today. Mass incarceration disproportionately targets Black Americans, creating a prison population that rivals antebellum slave populations. Police brutality continues, with unarmed Black people killed regularly by those sworn to protect and serve. Economic inequality ensures that descendants of enslaved people remain impoverished, while descendants of slave owners retain generational wealth. Systemic racism pervades every institution, education, healthcare, housing, employment, perpetuating disadvantages that began with slavery. In this context, Asha's rebellion remains relevant. It reminds us that systems of oppression do not reform themselves. They must be fought. It reminds us that resistance, even when it seems futile, plants seeds that may grow into future liberation. It reminds us that individual courage can inspire collective action. It reminds us that the fight for dignity and freedom is ongoing, that each generation must take up the struggle anew, that the work is never finished. Asha fought with a machete because that was the weapon available to her. We fight with votes, protests, civil disobedience, education, organization, legal action, and cultural production. The weapons differ, but the fight continues. If you have stayed with this story to the end, you have witnessed something that textbooks often sanitize or ignore: the visceral reality of slavery and the violent resistance it engendered. This is not comfortable history. This is not the sanitized version taught in schools. This is the truth. Slavery was a system of brutal violence, and resisting it sometimes required brutal violence in return. We can debate the ethics of that violence, but we cannot deny its occurrence or its necessity as seen by those who engaged in it. When law offers no protection, when society condones oppression, when every peaceful avenue is closed, humans will choose violence over continued suffering. Asha chose violence. So did Moses, Solomon, Jupiter, Samson, Rose, Dinah, Isaac, and Samuel. They chose it knowing it would lead to their deaths. They chose it anyway because dignity demanded it. Remember their names. Remember what they did. Remember why they did it. Remember that on July 4th, 1857, while white Americans celebrated independence with fireworks and speeches about liberty, enslaved Americans in New Orleans fought and died for the freedom that the Declaration of Independence had promised to all but delivered to few. Remember that the American story is not just one of liberty and justice, but also of slavery and resistance, oppression and rebellion. Remember that for every founding father celebrated in history, there are thousands of Ushers forgotten or deliberately erased. Remember that true history is messy and violent and uncomfortable and absolutely necessary to confront if we are to build a better future. The Gladiator of Louisiana died on August 15, 1857. Her body broken, but her spirit undefeated. She died knowing she had struck a blow that would echo through time. She died having proved that resistance was possible. She died free in the only way available to her, through death, but the story did not die with her. It lived on in whispers and songs and stories passed from generation to generation. It lives on today in this telling. It will live on in the future as long as people care about justice and dignity and the eternal human struggle against oppression. If this story has moved you to rage or grief or inspiration, good, that is the appropriate response. Channel that emotion into action. Learn more about this history. Support efforts to teach accurate history in schools. Fight against systems of oppression that persist today. Vote for justice. Protest injustice. Educate yourself and others. Remember the past, not to dwell in it, but to learn from it. To understand the roots of present problems, to avoid repeating past mistakes. Usher and her fellow warriors cannot benefit from our remembering. They are long dead. But we can benefit. Their courage can inspire our courage. Their resistance can inform our resistance. Their refusal to accept bondage can strengthen our refusal to accept injustice. This is the story of the Pitt Rebellion, the story of 11 people who chose death over dishonor, who fought impossible odds, who struck a blow for freedom that resonated far beyond their individual lives. This is the story of Usher, warrior of Dahomey, gladiator of Louisiana, freedom fighter, rebel, hero. This is American history, the part that makes us uncomfortable, the part that challenges comfortable narratives, the part that demands we face the full truth of our past. Remember it, tell it, let it change you. And when you face your own moments of choice between comfort and courage, between compliance and resistance, between accepting injustice and fighting it, remember what 11 enslaved fighters did on July 4th, 1857. They chose courage, they chose resistance, they chose to fight. The least we can do is remember them and carry forward their unfinished work. The fight continues.